Usually when we think about stories, we treat them as just mere entertainment, like a Netflix binge at the end of a long week,
Right.
right?
Yeah, or like a paperback you just take to the beach.
Exactly. Or, I mean, even a bedtime fairy tale you read just to get the kids to sleep. There's this unspoken assumption that real life is the serious stuff happening out in the physical world, and stories are just, well, they're the fictional escapes we retreat into.
That's definitely the default view, yeah.
But, I mean, what if we have that completely backward? What if stories are actually the biological and psychological software that we use to navigate reality itself?
It's a wild thought. And it forces this massive shift in how we understand our own behavior.
Hmm.
When you look closely at the architecture of the human mind, especially through the lens of the sources we're digging into today, you start to realize something profound. Narratives are not just, things we tell each other around a campfire. They are the actual structural frameworks that allow us to perceive the physical world. Without them, we'd just be completely paralyzed by the infinite complexity of everything around us.
And that is exactly the mission of today's deep dive into this source material. We are unpacking a genuinely fascinating stack of research that pulls together psychology, existential philosophy, neuroscience, and even ancient mythology.
It's a really broad stack, but it all connects beautifully.
It really does. So our goal for you today is to figure out exactly how narratives shape our personal destiny, how our physical actions literally define the reality we experience, and why the stories we act out every single day actually function as evolutionary survival guides.
To really grasp why humans are fundamentally these narrative-driven creatures, we actually have to start with the baseline mechanics of biology.
Okay, so we're starting with the hardware before the software.
Exactly, yeah. Before we can understand how a complex story works, we have to look at how we physically perceive the space around us.
Yeah.
The classical materialist view suggests that we just open our eyes and the world objectively floods in.
Like a camera just recording a room.
Right, exactly like a camera. But the sources argue that this is entirely wrong.
I want to pause right there, actually, because the sources bring up some pretty heavy terminology for this. I mean, they mention cybernetic theorists and phenomenological philosophers.
That is a mouthful, yeah.
Right. So for those of us who aren't, academic researchers, what do those words actually mean in the context of how we literally see the world?
Let's break those down because it's not as intimidating as it sounds. Cybernetics is essentially the study of goal-oriented systems. So think of how a guided missile works.
Okay.
Or even just a basic thermostat in your house. They constantly measure where they are against where they are programmed to be, and they just adjust their actions to close that gap.
Right. It's constantly self-correcting.
Exactly. And phenomenology, on the other hand, is the philosophical study of how we actually experience reality from the first-person perspective.
Yeah.
Like, not just the cold physics of the room, but what it feels like to be in the room.
Got it.
So when you combine them, you get this idea that human perception is entirely predicated on action. You don't just passively see things. You operate in this framework of action where you are at point A, which is your current, somewhat insufficient state, and you are trying to get to point B, which is a better desired future state.
Okay, let's unpack this with like a physical example so I can wrap my head around it. Say I am rushing through a crowded restaurant because I need to get to my table before my reservation is canceled.
A high-stress scenario.
Very high stress. So in that scenario, the other people in that restaurant aren't really quote unquote people to me anymore, right? In that specific moment, my goal getting to the table literally defines their reality to me.
Yes. They're filtered entirely through your goal.
So if someone is standing in my way, my brain just registers them as an obstacle. They literally generate negative emotion. But if, I don't know, a waiter steps aside and helps me through, my brain registers them as a tool or a helper, and they generate positive emotion.
That is exactly how the framework operates.
But wait, I'm struggling with this just a tiny bit. Is absolutely everything we see categorized as just a tool or an obstacle? I mean, what about art or simply looking at a really beautiful sunset? I'm not trying to get from point A to point B in that scenario.
That is a crucial distinction to make. We do have the capacity to suspend that active goal-oriented frame.
Okay, shoo.
Yeah, we aren't total robots.
Yeah.
We can suspend it during moments of deep contemplation or aesthetic appreciation or meditation. But our baseline biological mode of survival in the world, that is deeply cybernetic.
Okay, that makes sense. It's the default setting.
Right. Think about the fovea, the high-resolution center of your human eye. You can only focus intensely on a tiny, tiny fraction of your visual field at any one moment.
Everything else just kind of blurry.
Exactly. It fades into a lower resolution periphery.
Mm.
We are biologically designed to target what is relevant to our specific aims. One of the sources actually uses a pretty humorous analogy for this.
Oh, the bird analogy.
Yeah, it's like a predatory falcon, or even Zazu from The Lion King, looking down at the landscape. Our vision automatically highlights what matters for our immediate goal and screens out the infinite detail of everything else.
Mhm.
Because if we didn't do that, we would just be overwhelmed by sensory data.
So our physical eyesight is literally selective based on what we want. That is wild. And our emotions are tied directly to this visual mapping too, right?
Absolutely deeply tied to it.
They aren't just these random feelings welling up from nowhere. They are essentially a biological GPS system.
That's a great way to put it. Your emotions act as a real-time trajectory adjustment system. Going back to that guided missile analogy, a missile doesn't just fly perfectly straight. It constantly corrects its flight path.
Right, it zigzags a bit to stay on target.
Exactly. Positive emotions are the signal that you are successfully closing the gap toward your goal. Negative emotions like frustration, anger, fear, those are the alarms signaling that you are deviating from the path, or that an unexpected obstacle has just completely ruined your framework.
Wow. So if our biology is constantly mapping the physical world as this journey from an insufficient point A to a better point B, then a story is essentially just the linguistic description of that exact map.
Precisely. The simplest possible story you could ever tell is just, I was here, I went there, and this is how I managed it.
But human life is rarely that straightforward, unfortunately.
Oh, it rarely is.
Yeah.
Which is why the sources introduce the concept of a meta-story.
Okay, a meta story.
Yeah, a meta-story is about what happens when your map fails, when the frame collapses into chaos and you have to build an entirely new map just to survive.
The sources use this really great example of a kindergartner for this. The kid says, I was walking to school and a scary dog jumped at the fence. I was terrified and wanted to run home, but I found my courage, walked past the dog, and made it to school.
It's a perfect example.
Right, it's like a micro-hero narrative. The frame was disrupted by chaos. The child's biological GPS screamed negative emotion, but they reconfigured their internal map and moved forward into the unknown anyway.
Which is the core of every great myth.
But this actually raises a major question for me. If negative emotion means our trajectory is blocked and our survival is threatened, what does this mean for fiction?
How do you mean?
Well, why do we pay good money to go to a movie theater, sit in the dark, and watch a horror movie or an action film that genuinely stresses us out, like it makes our heart rate spike? Why seek out the feeling of a collapsed map?
Ah, right. Well, fiction allows us to run risk-free simulations of reality.
Yeah.
Let's look at an action hero franchise. Yeah. Like James Bond.
Okay,
A film like that is not meant to be hyper-realistic. It is a highly distilled abstraction of a specific pattern of behavior. The filmmakers observe thousands of human interactions, they edit out all the boring, mundane parts of life, and they give you the pure, concentrated essence of romantic adventure and crisis management.
Right, nobody wants to watch James Bond waiting in line at the DAV.
Exactly. So when you sit in the theater and watch it, you temporarily adopt the protagonist's emotional frame.
We get to mimic their perception, essentially. We're mapping their point A to point B onto our own nervous system.
You experience the physiological highs and lows, the threats and the triumphs, but without any actual physical danger to yourself. Is a brilliant evolutionary mechanism, really.
It lets us experiment with different ways of navigating the world without getting killed in the process.
Right. We are biologically rewarded with engagement for paying attention to these simulations because they teach us how to survive when we inevitably face our own unexpected obstacles in the real world.
But, navigating an obstacle assumes you actually know where you were going in the first place. Which brings us to the next massive concept in the sources. How do we know which map or which story is the right one to follow in our own lives?
Because there are infinite things we could aim at.
Right. And it turns out evolution gave us an internal compass for this too, which manifests as meaning and enthusiasm.
Meaning is so often treated as this airy philosophical concept that you just ponder in a coffee shop. But the research we are looking at argues that meaning is actually a deeply instinctual biological marker.
It's physical.
Yes, it is the physical sensation that tells us we are on an upward path of growth.
The biology here is what I find so compelling. The sources detail how the dopamine system in our, the network that regulates motivation and positive emotion is actually rooted deep in the brain and tied directly to our exploratory systems.
We are quite literally wired to enjoy the hunt more than the catch.
Yes. You don't get lasting happiness from achieving a goal. I mean, I've experienced this myself so many times. You spend months working on a huge project, you finally finish it, and instead of eternal bliss, you feel this weird sense of emptiness.
Yeah, consider the day after graduating from high school.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
You achieved the ultimate goal, you walked across the stage, but the next morning you wake up and all that positive emotion just vanishes.
Hmm.
Why? Because the goal has been attained, the cybernetic system no longer has a target to move toward.
And dopamine just shuts off.
It just shuts off.
So the joy is entirely in the forward movement toward a valuable goal. The enthusiasm we feel, which, by the way, comes from the Greek root entheos, meaning to be filled with the divine or a higher spirit, that enthusiasm is our biology, signaling that the destination is worth the energy expenditure.
This ties so deeply into the psychological concept of play, too, especially how children develop. Have you ever watched kids invent a game?
Oh yeah, they make up the rules as they go.
Right, but they instinctively calibrate the difficulty. If they make it too easy, they get bored and the dopamine drops. If they make it impossibly hard, they get crushed by negative emotion and just quit.
So they naturally find that sweet spot.
Exactly. They naturally set up a frame that pushes them just to the edge of their current capabilities.
Huh.
By balancing on that line between order and chaos, they maximize their enthusiasm and their biological development at the exact same time.
One of the sources calls this an upward spiral, or compares it to Jacob's ladder. For anyone unfamiliar, Jacob's ladder is this ancient biblical image of a ladder reaching from earth all the way up to heaven. It symbolizes this continuous ascending hierarchy of values.
You step up, you grow, the horizon expands, and then you find a new, higher step to aim at.
Right. So when you are properly oriented, aiming at a goal that challenges you and forces you to adapt, your nervous system responds by flooding you with a sense of deep, intrinsic meaning.
It is literally your body's way of telling you that you are acting out the correct structural map.
Okay, so if moving toward a properly calibrated goal gives us meaning, what happens when we pick the wrong goal? Or, honestly worse, what happens when we try to cheat the cybernetic system entirely?
Well, this requires us to look at the archetype of sacrifice.
Yeah.
To understand sacrifice, we have to look at the very top of your value hierarchy. Whatever you place at the pinnacle of your priorities, the ultimate goal that all your other sub-goals serve is, practically speaking, your God.
Okay, I follow you.
Human beings are unique in the animal kingdom because we discover the concept of the future. We realize that while we might have food today, we are incredibly vulnerable tomorrow.
Winter is always coming.
Winter is always coming. So humanity had to invent work.
And work is fundamentally the sacrifice of present pleasure for future security. It is the agonizing process of delaying gratification.
It acts as a covenant with the future. You give up something of value right now with the faith that the structure of reality will reward you with something better later. So the profound existential question that ancient humans wrestled with and encoded into all their myths was, what is the best possible pattern of sacrifice? What gets the best return from reality?
And the sources illustrate this beautifully through the ancient story of Cain and Abel.
Which is an incredibly short narrative, by the way.
Yeah, it's like what, maybe 15 lines of text? But it serves as the ultimate abstraction of this exact psychological problem. So Abel offers his best to the highest possible ideal. He sacrifices the firstlings of his flock. It's the absolute highest quality he has.
He holds nothing back.
Right, he puts his best foot forward, holding nothing back, and reality rewards him. His aim is true, and his life flourishes. But then you have Cain. Cain is a farmer, and he offers a sacrifice too, but the text implies it is, well, it's second rate.
He holds back.
Exactly. So why does reality reject Cain here? What is the actual psychological mechanism at play?
Cain is trying to cheat the system. He hopes he can offer a half-hearted effort, hold back his true potential, and still somehow extract the maximum reward from life.
We all know people who do that.
Oh, absolutely. And when reality inevitably rejects that second-rate sacrifice, Cain faces the same choice that every single human being faces when our efforts fail.
To crossroads.
Right. He can either humble himself, realize his aim, or his effort was insufficient, recalibrate his cybernetic map and try again. Or he can become deeply, bitterly resentful.
And of course he chooses resentment. He becomes furious at the cosmic order itself. And this is where the story gets incredibly dark. The sources point out a specific warning given to Cain in the text. If you do not do well, sin lies at the door.
And the original language for that is fascinating.
Yeah, it describes this sin as a sexually aroused, predatory animal just waiting to pounce. That is such a specific, chilling piece of imagery. Why describe resentment as a predatory beast?
Because resentment is not a passive emotion.
Hmm.
It has an animating life of its own.
Yeah.
The imagery suggests a parasitic possession. If you invite bitterness in, if you just sit in your room and nurse your grievances about how unfair the world
Which
is,
is so easy to do.
it's the easiest thing in the world. But that resentment consumes you. You become a puppet to that dark motivational state. Cain invites the predator in, and it culminates in him murdering his brother, Abel. But psychologically, he isn't just killing his brother.
He's killing the ideal.
Yes, he is trying to destroy the very ideal of success and goodness, because Abel's success highlights Cain's own inadequacy.
Wow. The sources make a direct connection here from this ancient myth to the modern world, specifically pointing to the psychological blueprint of a school shooter. How does a rejected sacrifice turn into that level of catastrophic violence?
The mechanism is literally identical. You have an individual who experiences repeated failure or social rejection. Instead of adjusting their aim, they decide the entire structure of existence is fundamentally corrupt.
They invite the predator in.
They invite in that predatory resentment. They might spend 10,000 hours in a basement just fantasizing about revenge. Ultimately, the bitterness demands action, and they decide to violently destroy the innocent as a way of shaking their fist at reality itself.
It is the ultimate manifestation of a corrupted narrative map.
Exactly. It's the map leading straight to hell.
So, if resentment can turn one individual into a monster, what happens when millions of people in a society simultaneously lose their unifying narrative and succumb to that same bitterness? Does the whole society become Cain?
Unfortunately, yes. This scales up to the macro level terrifyingly well, and it brings us to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. In the late 19th century, Nietzsche famously pronounced that God is dead and we have killed him.
People usually misunderstand this quote so much. They think Nietzsche was this arrogant rationalist celebrating the end of religion, but the sources emphasize that it was not a triumphant statement at all.
No, it was a profound warning.
Right. Nietzsche was known for philosophizing with a hammer. His analytical writing was so penetrating that it smashed the foundational axiomatic presumptions of Western culture, specifically the Judeo-Christian ethic that had provided the overarching structural map for society for thousands of years.
Right.
Break that down for me, though. If we go back to the biology we talked about earlier, the cybernetic GPS system that requires a goal, what does it mean to say he used a hammer on the society's values?
Think of it as deleting the ultimate aim from the collective biological GPS. If a society operates on a shared narrative map, and you prove that the ultimate destination on that map is a complete fiction, the entire structure crumbles.
The GPS just recalculates endlessly.
Yes. Nietzsche saw the foundation weakening due to the scientific revolution and Enlightenment rationality. He tapped on the weak spots with his hammer and the whole edifice collapsed. But he was terrified because he knew human beings cannot operate without a map.
So what fills the void? The sources say Nietzsche prophesied two distinct catastrophic consequences. First, a descent into universal nihilism, a pervasive sense of rootlessness and extreme demoralization.
Right, because if the ultimate up is removed from the compass, people just become adrift.
And if everything is equally meaningless, you have no reason to act. You are paralyzed.
But human psychology cannot tolerate the anxiety of paralyzed nihilism for long. It's unbearable. We desperately need a system to organize the complexity of the world into manageable tools and obstacles. Without a shared map, society devolves into what philosopher Thomas Hobbes called a war of all against all.
A brutal state of nature where fractured groups with conflicting value structures just tear each other apart.
Exactly. And to escape that overwhelming chaos, Nietzsche predicted the second consequence, the rise of utopian totalitarian ideologies.
So people latch on to absolute rigid political ideologies just to stop the anxiety of the chaos.
They seek out false maps. He foresaw that people, driven by the exact same envious resentment we saw in the story of Cain, would flock to totalitarian systems which later manifested as fascism and communism in the 20th century.
Those systems promised a perfectly ordered, rational utopia.
They provided a temporary sense of direction and unity, curing the nihilism. But because they were rooted in resentment and the destruction of perceived enemies rather than genuine, upward-aiming sacrifice, they inevitably led to mass murder and gulags.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and reflect on how this applies to the micro level of your own life. Think about what happens if you lose your central narrative, your personal why.
It's deeply disorienting.
It is. Say you lose a career you built your entire identity around, or you go through a terrible divorce. You immediately feel that profound physiological anxiety of aimlessness. The physical world literally stops making sense because your cybernetic map has dissolved.
You can't even tell what is an obstacle and what is an opportunity anymore.
Right. You are forced to prioritize something, you have to aim at something just to be able to see the world clearly again.
That is the inescapable biological reality of our existence.
Yeah.
You must put something at the top of your value hierarchy. You must have an ultimate goal, whether you use the word God or not.
So the question isn't whether you have a narrative.
No, the question is whether the narrative you are acting out is leading you upward toward growth and meaning or downward toward resentment and chaos.
Let's trace the massive journey we have just taken. We started with the literal mechanics of cybernetics and human eyesight, proving that we only perceive the world through the active lens of a goal.
We looked at how stories and movies are linguistic and emotional simulations of those goal-oriented maps.
We uncovered the mechanism of the dopamine system, which rewards us not for getting what we want, but for the heroic act of moving towards something valuable.
We explored the psychology of sacrifice, how aiming high and giving our absolute best is the only way to satisfy the demands of reality, while half-hearted efforts just invite the predatory chaos of resentment.
And finally, we looked at Nietzsche's hammer, demonstrating the historical catastrophe that occurs when a society loses its unifying story, deletes its GPS target, and falls prey to nihilism and totalitarianism.
There's a lot to process.
It is, but the overarching truth from all these sources is that stories aren't just things we consume for fun. They are the software that runs human action. And our actions, what we physically do in the world, literally define the reality we experience.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider today.
Lay it on us.
We know now that your sensory perceptions are biologically tuned to highlight obstacles based on your ultimate goal. So take a hard look at the things that consistently frustrate you in your daily life. The people who annoy you, the situations that make you bitter. Are they actually just bad luck? Or is your overarching aim misaligned, causing your brain to constantly manifest the world as a series of blockades and enemies?
That's a heavy question.
It is. If you fundamentally change what you are aiming at, does the physical world around you change its shape?